Attention! Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the summer of 1843, the Witfield plantation stood as one of the largest estates in Wilkes County, Georgia. Located 17 miles southwest of Washington, the county seat, the sprawling property cast long shadows across 400 acres of cotton fields. What distinguished this plantation wasn't its size, however, but rather the peculiar dynamic that existed within its walls. A dynamic that would eventually unravel into one of the most disturbing chapters in the region's history. According to county records from the period, the plantation belonged to Jeremiah Witfield, a second-generation tobacco merchant who had transitioned to cotton production following the market shifts of the 1820s. Whitfield was known locally as a man of contradictions, outwardly pious in his Methodist faith, yet rumored to harbor unusual ideas about the management of his household. The plantation house itself was a two-story federal-style structure with 6 white columns supporting a modest portico. Behind the main house stood a series of smaller structures, the overseer's cottage, equipment barns, and 2 rows of simple wooden cabins where the enslaved workers lived. What visitors often noted about the Witfield plantation was its unusual quietness. While other plantations in the area buzzed with activity and voices, Whitfield's property seemed to exist under a perpetual blanket of silence. This silence, as parish records would later suggest, was the first sign that something was fundamentally wrong at the Witfield estate. The most unusual aspect of the plantation was not immediately visible to casual visitors. According to tax records from 1838, Witfield had purchased 2 young men from a slave auction in Charleston, brothers according to the bill of sale. These were not ordinary field hands, however. The brothers, who would later be identified in court documents as Thomas and Samuel, were described as identical in appearance, literate, and of mixed heritage. The purchase price listed in the ledger was nearly triple the standard rate for male laborers, suggesting their perceived value. What the documents don't explain is why Whitfield chose to house these brothers not in the workers' cabins, but in a specially constructed addition to the main house, a detail that would later feature prominently in the investigations that followed. The first documented peculiarity appeared in the journal of Rebecca Carrington, wife of a neighboring plantation owner, who noted after a dinner at the Whitfield home in the spring of 1840, "Mrs. Whitfield was indisposed again this evening, and her sister too seemed altered in temperament. Neither took more than a few bites. The household operates with strange formality, as if choreographed. Their new house servants, twins, I believe, never speak but seem to anticipate every need. Mr. Whitfield speaks of their efficiency with uncommon pride." What Mrs. Carrington could not have known then was that the women she identified as Mrs. Whitfield and her sister were, in fact, both legally Jeremiah Whitfield's wives, Eliza and Catherine Whitfield, twin sisters from a once prominent family in Virginia whose fortune had collapsed following a series of failed investments. According to marriage records in the Wilkes County Courthouse, Jeremiah had married Eliza in 1836. No record exists of a marriage to Catherine. The unusual household arrangement might have remained private indefinitely, if not for the events that began to unfold in the early months of 1843. According to a seldom referenced church ledger discovered during renovations of the First Methodist Church of Washington in 1968, Eliza Whitfield abruptly ceased attendance at Sunday services in February of 1843. The pastor's notations indicate he made 3 separate visits to the plantation to inquire after her health. On his third visit, according to his private correspondence later collected by the Georgia Historical Society, he reported something troubling. Mrs. Whitfield receives me with strange detachment. She speaks as if reading from prepared remarks. When I inquired directly about her absence from worship, she indicated that she found greater spiritual fulfillment in private devotions. More concerning was her sister's appearance in the doorway, dressed identical to Mrs. Whitfield in every detail, down to the arrangement of her hair. Neither woman seemed to find this unusual. Mrs. Whitfield's explanation that the sisters have always shared similar tastes rings hollow. What happened next is documented through multiple sources, though with significant inconsistencies. According to county medical records, Dr. William Harrison was summoned to the plantation on April 9, 1843, to attend to a female patient. His records note, patient presents with symptoms consistent with early pregnancy. Physical examination confirms approximately 3 months development. Patient exhibits unusual emotional detachment regarding her condition. The doctor's ledger does not specify which woman he examined, listing only Mrs. Whitfield as the patient. A separate entry, dated April 12th, just 3 days later, contains an identical diagnosis for a patient also identified as Mrs. Whitfield. This medical anomaly might have remained a private matter if not for the events of June 3, 1843. According to sheriff's reports preserved in county archives, a house servant from a neighboring plantation sought assistance, claiming to have witnessed an arrangement against nature while delivering a package to the Whitfield home. The resulting investigation revealed the first layers of what would become known in private correspondence as the Witfield arrangement. Testimony from various servants and workers, compiled by Sheriff Thomas McAllister, painted a disturbing picture. The twin brothers, Thomas and Samuel, had developed intimate relationships with the Whitfield women. Relationships that Jeremiah Whitfield not only permitted, but apparently orchestrated. What makes this case particularly disturbing isn't merely the violation of period social boundaries or legal statutes, but rather the methodical nature of the arrangement. According to documents sealed until 1945, Jeremiah Whitfield had carefully selected the twin brothers specifically for their resemblance to each other, just as he had married twin sisters. The sealed court records indicate that Whitfield maintained detailed journals describing what he called his greatest experiment, an attempt to create what he termed mirrored bloodlines. His writings, fragmentary portions of which were entered into evidence, reveal a disturbed mind obsessed with theories of heredity and bloodline purity that went far beyond even the already troubling racial theories of his time. The most chilling aspect of the case emerged when investigators discovered a hidden cellar beneath the eastern wing of the main house. According to the sheriff's report, the underground chamber contained a collection of medical instruments, detailed anatomical drawings, and jars containing preserved biological specimens. Dr. Harrison, when called to examine the findings, reportedly refused to provide a full statement, noting only that the contents reflected interests inconsistent with medical science as currently understood. By July of 1843, the case had drawn attention from Washington, the county seat. Records indicate that several prominent citizens, concerned about potential scandal, attempted to suppress further investigation. A letter from Judge Everett Hamilton to the governor, dated July 17th, suggests the case touched on matters too delicate for public examination and recommended discretionary handling to preserve community stability. This suppression might have succeeded if not for the unexpected arrival of Catherine and Eliza's uncle, Colonel James Barrett, from Richmond. Barrett, a widower with no children of his own, had been searching for his nieces for nearly 7 years, having lost contact after their father's financial collapse. Upon learning of their situation, Barrett demanded a formal investigation. According to court records, the inquiry that followed was conducted behind closed doors, with testimony sealed by judicial order. What emerged publicly was sanitized. Jeremiah Whitfield was charged not with the full extent of his actions, but merely with improper household management and violations of racial integrity statutes, the latter referring to the relationships between the enslaved brothers and the white Whitfield women. The brothers themselves were never permitted to testify. According to a notation in the sheriff's personal journal, discovered in 1952 during a courthouse renovation, Thomas and Samuel were separated and sold to different buyers in Louisiana and Mississippi, respectively, their identities obscured to prevent any connection to the Whitfield case. The fate of Catherine and Eliza remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Following the trial, court records indicate they were committed to the Georgia State Asylum in Milledgeville under diagnosis of moral insanity and hysteria. Admission records from the asylum, partially preserved in the state archives, note that the women were initially housed in separate wards, but would become severely agitated unless permitted to see each other daily. The medical superintendent's quarterly report from December 1843 contains a disturbing observation. The Whitfield women continue to exhibit synchronized behaviors despite complete separation. They speak in unison when together, finish each other's sentences when apart, and have developed identical physical mannerisms. More concerning, both continue to insist they are carrying children fathered by the same man, though medical examination has confirmed neither is pregnant. This last detail contradicts Dr. Harrison's initial diagnosis, suggesting either a false pregnancy or, more disturbingly, the possibility that any pregnancies were terminated during the investigation. No records exist to clarify this discrepancy. Jeremiah Whitfield's fate provides another unsettling chapter in this narrative. Following a brief incarceration in the county jail, he was released on bond pending formal sentencing. On September 21, 1843, according to the sheriff's report, Whitfield returned to his plantation, by then largely abandoned by its workers. The following morning, a neighboring farmer reported seeing smoke rising from the Whitfield property. By the time assistance arrived, the main house was engulfed in flames. Once the fire was extinguished, investigators discovered Whitfield's body in his study, seated at his desk. According to the coroner's report, death was attributed to smoke inhalation, though the report notes the unusual position of the body, which showed no signs of attempted escape. More disturbing was the discovery made by the sheriff while searching the ruins. In a metal box that had survived the fire, they found a document dated the previous day, Whitfield's final journal entry. The contents, partially included in the sealed case file, reveal a man convinced of his own visionary status. What they cannot comprehend, they seek to destroy. The experiment, however, is already complete. The bloodlines are merged. The mirroring is perfected. What I have set in motion cannot be undone, even by fire. The case might have faded entirely from public memory if not for a series of articles published in the Athens newspaper in 1879, following the death of the last direct participant, Dr. Harrison. The articles, written under a pseudonym later revealed to be Harrison's nephew, presented a sanitized account of unusual circumstances at a plantation near Washington some 36 years earlier. These articles prompted a limited official response from county authorities, who issued a statement indicating that any such matters had been thoroughly addressed and resolved according to the laws of the time. The case was effectively reburied. In 1938, during research for a comprehensive history of Wilkes County, historian Margaret Thornton stumbled upon references to the Whitfield case in private correspondence between several prominent families. In her published history, she includes only a footnote mentioning unsubstantiated rumors regarding unusual domestic arrangements at the Witfield plantation, which burned under mysterious circumstances in 1843. The most disturbing postscript to this narrative emerged in 1967, when construction workers excavating for a new county administrative building in Washington discovered a small metal container in the foundation of the old courthouse. Her subsequent requests to access the sealed court records were repeatedly denied. Inside was a sealed envelope containing what appeared to be a personal letter from Sheriff McAllister to his successor, dated December 18, 143. The letter, now preserved in the state archives, contains a troubling revelation. I must unburden myself regarding the Witfield matter. Before the brothers were transported south for sale, the younger one, Samuel, I believe, managed to speak with me privately. What he revealed suggests dimensions to this case far beyond what we have documented. According to his account, Witfield had been conducting his experiments for years before bringing the brothers to Georgia. Samuel claimed there were other pairs, twins or siblings of similar appearance, who had been part of Whitfield's household in Virginia and possibly Maryland before disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Most disturbing was his insistence that the Witfield property contains evidence of these earlier experiments, evidence he claimed is buried in the North Field beneath an unusual oak with a split trunk. I have not investigated this claim, nor do I intend to. Some matters, I have concluded, are best left buried. I leave this record only so that should questions ever arise again, you will know there are depths to this case that remain unplumbed. According to county records, no investigation of the property was ever conducted. The plantation lands were sold at auction in 1844, divided among 3 different buyers. The main house was never rebuilt. By 1900, the property had been subdivided further into smaller farms and residential parcels. In 1969, following the discovery of Sheriff McAllister's letter, a graduate student in history from the University of Georgia attempted to locate the split trunk oak mentioned in Samuel's account. According to his thesis notes, he identified a location matching the description, by then part of a private residence. His request to conduct an archaeological survey was denied by both the property owner and the County Historical Society. The student's faculty advisor later reported that after returning from his final site visit to Wilkes County, the young man abandoned his thesis and withdrew from the university program. Attempts to contact him for follow-up in 1972 were unsuccessful. His last known communication was a brief note to the department secretary. Some histories resist examination. I've come to believe that resistance serves a purpose. Today, nothing remains of the Witfield plantation that would be recognizable to its former inhabitants. The lands have been developed, parceled, and repurposed through the intervening decades. The asylum where Catherine and Eliza spent their remaining years was demolished in 1951. The courthouse that held the original trial records was replaced in 1904, though many documents were transferred to state archives. What persists are the questions about how thoroughly the investigation was conducted, about what truly motivated Jeremiah Whitfield, and about the fates of all those caught in his experiment. The fragmentary nature of the surviving records ensures that some aspects of this disturbing chapter will never be fully illuminated. Perhaps most unsettling is the possibility, suggested by Samuel's statement to Sheriff McAllister, that the Whitfield case represents not an isolated incident, but rather one chapter in a longer, darker narrative, a narrative whose earlier volumes remain buried, both figuratively and perhaps literally. The final note in the official file on the Whitfield case is a memo from the state archivist in 1969 recommending that the complete records remain restricted from general public access due to their potentially disturbing nature and limited historical value. This restriction was reaffirmed in 1992 and remains in effect. As for the split trunk oak and whatever might lie beneath it, that remains undisturbed, protected not by official decree, but by the collective reluctance to unearth what Witfield may have left behind. In Wilkes County today, few residents recognize the Witfield name or know anything of the events of 1843. The silence that once characterized the plantation now extends across time itself, broken only by this account, an echo of whispers long suppressed. Perhaps some histories are indeed best left in silence, yet silence itself can become a kind of testimony to what we fear to know, to what we choose not to remember, and to the persistent power of the past to disturb our present understanding. The Witfield case, with its incomplete records and unanswered questions, stands as a shadow on the landscape of history, a reminder that beneath the ordered narrative of our collective past lie darker currents that occasionally rise to the surface, demanding recognition before subsiding once again into silence. And perhaps somewhere in Wilkes County, on land once owned by Jeremiah Whitfield, there still stands an oak with a split trunk, its roots reaching down into soil that holds secrets no one has been willing to unearth for nearly 2 centuries. The tree itself would be ancient now, gnarled by time and weather, its branches stretched like arthritic fingers toward the sky, a living monument to memories deliberately forgotten. In the archives in Atlanta, the Whitfield files remain under restriction. In Milledgeville, the grounds where the asylum once stood are now part of a university campus. And in Washington, Georgia, life continues, the past and present separated by nothing more substantial than time and the human capacity for forgetting. Yet in 1978, an unusual postscript to this story emerged when Amanda Clifton, a genealogist researching her family history, discovered a connection to the Witfield case. According to her findings, her great-grandmother had been employed briefly as a nurse's assistant at the Milledgeville Asylum during the period when Catherine and Eliza were institutionalized there. The discovery came through a packet of letters preserved by Clifton's family, correspondence from her great-grandmother to her sister in Atlanta, dated between 1844 and 1847. In one letter, dated March 12, 1845, she writes, "The Witfield women remain our most peculiar patients. Despite being kept in separate wings as Dr. Mayfield insists, they exhibit behaviors that defy explanation. When the attendants brought them together, thinking it might calm them, they spoke in perfect unison, describing identical dreams they claimed to have shared the previous night." Clifton's subsequent research led her to death records indicating that Eliza Whitfield died on September 4th, 1847, from what was recorded as acute melancholia resulting in physical decline. Catherine, according to the same records, died exactly 7 days later, with the cause listed identically. Last Tuesday at precisely 3 o'clock, both women began to sing the same hymn, "Abide with me," though neither could possibly hear the other. The attending physician's notes, partially preserved in the hospital's quarterly report, observe, "Following the death of her sister, patient C ceased all verbal communication and refused nourishment despite repeated attempts at intervention." The psychological dependence between the patients appears to have extended beyond rational medical explanation. This detail might have remained nothing more than a curious footnote, if not for a discovery made in 1982, when researchers from Emory University's Department of Psychology were granted limited access to the Whitfield files as part of a broader study on 19th-century approaches to mental illness. Their published paper makes only a bleak reference to the case, noting that period diagnosis often confused psychological trauma resulting from exploitation with inherent mental deficiency or moral corruption. One of the researchers, however, Dr. Eleanor Pearson, maintained a private interest in the case beyond the scope of the official study. Through persistent requests and academic credentials, she eventually gained access to previously unreleased medical records from the Milledgeville Asylum. What she found suggests a dimension to the Witfield case that goes beyond even the disturbing elements already documented. According to Dr. Pearson's private notes, later donated to the University of Georgia's Special Collections, Catherine Whitfield's medical file contained an anomalous entry dated January 18, 1847, more than 3 years after her commitment. The attending physician had documented a physical examination prompted by Catherine's complaints of abdominal pain. His findings indicated that she had, at some point, given birth, a revelation that contradicted the official record stating that any pregnancies had been terminated or were psychological in nature. Dr. Pearson's attempts to locate birth records or any documentation of a child were unsuccessful. The asylum's records contain no mention of an infant born to either Whitfield woman, nor any transfer of a child to another institution or family. This absence itself became Dr. Pearson's primary concern, as she noted in her research journal. The systematic erasure of this birth from official records suggests a deliberate attempt to excise not just the event, but its implications from historical memory. Her subsequent investigation led her to parish records from St. James Episcopal Church in Milledgeville, where she discovered a baptismal entry dated March 3, 1844. The entry records the baptism of infant twins, male, surname Davis, with no parents listed, only a notation that they were under the guardianship of the church until suitable placement could be arranged. The timing would align with pregnancies that began shortly before the Whitfield case became public. Dr. Pearson's attempt to trace these children through adoption or placement records proved fruitless. The church records indicate only that the twins were placed with a Christian family relocating westward in the summer of 1844. No names or destinations are provided. This gap in the record might have remained permanent if not for a seemingly unrelated discovery in 1989, when renovations to an old home in Franklin, Tennessee, revealed a hidden compartment behind a bookcase containing a leather-bound journal. The journal, according to the subsequent owner's statement to the Tennessee Historical Society, appeared to be the private diary of Reverend James Caldwell, who had served as pastor of St. James Church in Milledgeville before relocating to Tennessee in 1846. The journal contains a disturbing entry dated July 17, 1844. The matter of the Whitfield infants is finally resolved. A suitable family has been identified, the Prestons from Virginia, childless and eager for sons. They depart tomorrow for Missouri Territory, far enough removed that the stain of the children's origins will never follow them. I have impressed upon Mrs. Preston the importance of separating the boys as they grow older. The unusual connection observed between the Whitfield women must not be permitted to manifest in their offspring. One child will remain with them, the other will be placed with Mrs. Preston's sister in Illinois once he reaches the age of 5. May God forgive this necessary deception and grant these innocent souls the chance to escape their unnatural heritage. This entry raises disturbing questions about the true extent of the experiments Jeremiah Whitfield conducted and their lasting implications, questions that extend well beyond the immediate events of 1843. If Catherine and Eliza did indeed bear children fathered by Thomas and Samuel, and if those children were secretly placed with families unaware of their origins, the story of the Whitfield plantation may have branches extending into the present day. Dr. Pearson's attempts to trace the Preston family through census and property records identified several possible matches in Missouri during the appropriate period, but without more specific information, she was unable to determine which might have been the family that received the Witfield children. Her research notes conclude with a troubling observation. If Reverend Caldwell's concerns about unusual connection were founded in observed behaviors rather than mere superstition, and if this trait does indeed have a hereditary component as Whitfield apparently believed, then the separation of these children may have initiated two distinct family lines, each carrying forward elements of Whitfield's experiment without any awareness of their true origins. In 1993, Dr. Pearson published a heavily redacted account of her findings in the Journal of Historical Psychology under the title Generational Echoes, Psychological Trauma and Heredity in a 19th Century Case Study. The article makes no direct reference to the Whitfield case, using pseudonyms and altered locations. Nevertheless, the university received several inquiries from descendants of families named Preston in Missouri and Illinois, concerned about possible connections to the case described. Dr. Pearson declined all requests for additional information, citing ethical considerations regarding genetic privacy and the potential psychological impact on individuals who might discover unexpected connections to the Whitfield case. In her last interview before her death in 1997, she explained her position. History is not merely what happened, but what we can bear to know about what happened. Some knowledge serves no constructive purpose. It merely transfers the trauma of the past into the present. I've come to believe that certain historical silences may be merciful rather than deceptive. The most recent development in this long-dormant case occurred in 2008, when construction for a highway expansion near the former Whitfield property unearthed human remains. Archaeological assessment determined the remains were from the mid-19th century, located in what would have been the north field of the original plantation, near where the split-trunk oak would have stood. County officials quickly reclassified the site as a previously undocumented cemetery, and the remains were reinterred without detailed forensic analysis. A brief mention in the local newspaper noted only that historical remains discovered during highway construction have been respectfully relocated in accordance with state regulations governing unmarked burial sites. No connection to the Whitfield case was publicly acknowledged. Today, the story of the Whitfield plantation exists in fragments, scattered across archived documents, sealed records, private correspondence, and physical evidence that remains largely unexamined. The full truth of what occurred there in the years leading up to 1843, and the possible consequences that have rippled forward through time, may never be fully known. Perhaps this is fitting. The horror of the Whitfield case lies not merely in the events themselves, but in their resistance to complete understanding. In the spaces between documented facts where imagination inevitably fills the void, with possibilities more disturbing than certainty might be. For those who study history's darkest corners, the Whitfield case stands as a reminder that the most unsettling narratives are those that remain partially obscured, visible enough to disturb, but incomplete enough to haunt. Like the split-trunk oak that may have marked Whitfield's buried secrets, the story itself has divided roots, some exposed to historical examination, others remaining buried beneath layers of silence, suppression, and the passage of time. In Wilkes County today, few remember the Whitfield name. The land where the plantation once stood has been subdivided, developed, and transformed through generations of new ownership. Nothing remains of the original structures. The split-trunk oak, if it ever existed, has long since succumbed to time or development. The physical evidence of what occurred there has been erased by progress and deliberate forgetting. Yet something of the story persists. In archived documents few will ever read, in academic papers cited primarily by specialists, in the genetic heritage of families who may never know their connection to events set in motion almost 2 centuries ago, and now in this account. Perhaps the final word on the Witfield case belongs to Dr. Eleanor Pearson, who wrote in her private journal shortly before her death, "Some histories refuse complete revelation, preserving their mysteries across generations. The Witfield case represents not merely a historical puzzle with missing pieces, but rather a narrative that actively resists reconstruction, as if the truth itself recognizes that full disclosure would be more burden than illumination. In such cases, the historian must acknowledge the limits not just of available evidence, but of our capacity to comprehend the darkest aspects of human nature without being diminished by that comprehension. The split trunk oak may be gone, but its symbolic resonance remains, a living metaphor for histories that divide and branch in unexpected ways, for narratives that simultaneously invite and resist understanding, and for the persistent shadow that the past casts upon the present, even when we choose not to see it. And somewhere, perhaps, descendants of those twin brothers and twin sisters continue their separate lives, unaware of the dark experiment that brought their bloodlines into being, an experiment designed to create mirrored lives and synchronized souls, an experiment whose full results can never be known with certainty. The silence that once hung over the Witfield plantation now extends across time itself, a silence that speaks volumes to those willing to listen closely enough to hear what remains deliberately unspoken.